So hello and thanks so much for having me today. In this paper, I'd like to look at some representations of birdsong in romantic poetry, and particularly in the poetry of John Clare. My paper is drawn from my book, Birdsong, Speech and Poetry, The Art of Composition in the Long 19th Century, which, as Jessica kindly mentioned, is coming out with Cambridge University Press later this year. My research has been influenced by interdisciplinary approaches, which have drawn together and compared the different ways in which scientists, musicians, and poets have listened to and tried to understand the everyday mystery of birdsong. Our fascination with birdsong may be traced all the way back to our earliest, most rudimentary attempts to translate these sounds into human words and phrases. The Eastern Towie apparently tells us to drink your tea. The white-throated sparrow in America says, Old Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. And the yellowhammer in traditional rural English, a little bit of bread and no cheese. Here's the Eastern Towie. Well, what do you think? Does that sound like drink your tea to you? Yep. Unquestionably, these traditional bird sound mnemonics have proved useful in helping birders to remember and distinguish between the notes of different species. But we can also see the problem here. We can capture some of the rhythms of the white-throated sparrow in that repetition of Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. But is the Eastern Towie really telling us to drink our tea? Of course, the birds aren't really speaking, not to us anyway. Whenever we attempt to translate the sounds of birds into our own words and phrases, we're always thus in danger of descending into anthropomorphism and absurdity, of making the birds sound ludicrously like ourselves. In many ways, the transcription of the yellowhammer's call tells us less about the bird itself than it does about the very thin and very hungry ploughboy whom the writer and naturalist Richard Jefferies heard repeating its phrases over and over to himself in the late 19th century. For, as Jefferies dryly noted, to have only a hunch of bread and little or no cheese was all too frequently this poor boy's own case. You can see here on this slide a portrait of one very cold and very hungry bird scarer by Sir George Clausen. Just look how thin he is. In the 1960s, the scientist William Thorpe was able to obtain a far more precise picture of birdsong following the advent of a new piece of technology, the sonogram. The sonogram enabled scientists like Thorpe to slow down and visually analyze the complex patterning of a bird's voice. Here we have a precise visual picture of the sounds the bird is making. Notice the timescale at the bottom of the diagram. These are sounds and structures which escape the human ear, which we cannot hear in the bird's own time, never mind translate into our music, or least of all, our language. So where does this leave poetry? When you compare representations of birdsong in science, music, and poetry, this kind of interdisciplinary approach can, I think, really get you thinking about what makes poetry special or unique, what poetry can and cannot do, and how it differs from, for example, a scientific chart. Birdsong tests the limits of language, and consequently it has inspired poets from across the generations to experiment with, as well as to profoundly reflect upon, the nature of the medium in which they work. Unquestionably, the Song of Birds is central to a wider exploration in the Romantic period of the relationship between word and world, between poetic form and the natural sights and sounds it seeks to portray. Poetry may never be able to explain that everyday mystery of how or what or why birds sing. It can tell us something about itself, about language and how it shapes our world. I'd like to spend the remainder of the time today focusing on John Clare, because I think his writing gets the balance, which I believe characterises some of the best writing about birdsong. The balance, that is, between a close, detailed attention to the sounds the bird is making and a profound respect for the irrevocable otherness of those sounds. One summer, Clare attempted to take down the notes of a nightingale that had been singing constantly, as it were, at my very door. Unfortunately, I have neither the time nor perhaps quite the courage to read this through in full for you now. But what we can immediately see here is that Clare was a closely attentive student of the nightingale, both painstakingly precise and extraordinarily inventive in his attempts to get the sound of the bird into his own writing. But the so-called peasant poet was not naive. If it is difficult to avoid the idea that Clare's nightingale is telling us to cheer up, is it also telling us to bring a jug? Clare may be seen as self-consciously playing on and, in a sense, parodying his own inflected phrases in those last smiling lines. Throughout his poetry, Clare demonstrates his awareness of how the sounds of birds are reshaped and recast according to what Emily Dickinson called the fashion of the ear, as he writes in The Landrail. "'Tis like a fancy everywhere, a sort of living doubt. We know 'tis something, but it ne'er will blab the secret out." That word blab finally captures a central tension in writing about birdsong, tantalizingly close to human language in some respects. The sounds of birds have often seemed to resemble an incipient mode of communication, on the very verge of breaking into words, and yet never quite doing so. Ironically, the bird's secret can never be translated into a language we could understand. The abiding mystery offers Clare a kind of release or escape from what he describes in his poem Birds Nesting as learning's way. In this poem, Clare dramatizes the different schools of thought through which human beings have attempted to decipher the mystery. But the schoolboy, the scientist, and the poet each end up naming and thus imposing meaning upon the birds which they cannot understand in their own terms. The woodmen call them in their way the willow biters, 'cause they see them biting in the month of May the young shoots of the willow tree. But what they are in learning's way is all unknown to them or me. In birds nesting, there is no single authoritative perspective, but rather a series of different ways of looking, interpreting, guessing. The abiding mystery enables Clare to challenge the authority of the learned. The willow biters neither know nor care what they are in learning's way. Their imperviousness is liberating, as it enables Clare to wriggle free from the various names and classifications imposed not only upon the bird, but also upon himself as a so-called peasant poet. Throughout his poetry, Clare explores how the sounds of birds are differently interpreted according to not only a person's background, class, or education, but also their mood or state of mind. He recognizes, for example, that the horrible apprehensions of villagers journeying home in the dark may have led them to mistake the dead, thin, whistling sort of sound of the nighthawk for the signal calls of robbers in pursuit. Clare incorporated this common kind of mishearing into one of his village tales, Going to the Fair. Crake went the landrail in the wind-waved grain, whom idle schoolboys hearing chased in vain. In Simon's mind, the noise bespoke his fate. He thought it mattered, he was all too late. Choose it, the poet screamed in swapping wooers. Choose it, said Simon, I know whom to choose. Thus ne'er a bird could sing, but Simon's cares shaped it to something of his own affairs. Again, Clare satirizes the vanity of the human endeavour to understand the call of a bird, vain not only in the sense of being unfruitful, unattainable, but also in the sense that we, like Simon, inevitably shape these sounds according to our own emotional needs and preoccupations. We can return to those familiar words and phrases which Clare admits into his transcription of the Nightingale song. We can catch his sense of human absurdity in the Nightingale's insistence that we bring a jug, bring a jug, bring a jug.